The photograph had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases ran through the woman's face like pale rivers. And still Clyde Lawson thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever laid eyes on in all his 28 years of living on this dusty, unforgiving earth. He sat on the steps of the Holloway Creek stagecoach depot in the late August heat of 1878, rolling the brim of his hat between his calloused fingers, and pulled the photograph from his breast pocket for what he reckoned was the 100th time that week. The image had been sent ahead by the matchmaker in Kansas City, a stout woman named Mrs. Clara Renfield, who ran a correspondence service for lonesome settlers and ranchers out west. Clyde's older brother, Thomas, had pushed him into the whole arrangement after Clyde's 33rd rejection of a dinner invitation from the daughters of neighboring ranchers. "You are going to die alone and miserable on that patch of land," Thomas had told him one evening over a bottle of sarsaparilla on the porch of the Lawson ranch. "And you will deserve every single lonely minute of it." Clyde had written to Mrs. Renfield mostly to get Thomas to hush. He had not expected anything to come of it. He had not expected the photograph. The woman in the image was standing in what looked like a parlor, her dark hair swept up in the fashion of the city, her eyes catching the light of whatever lamp had been burning nearby when the photographer took the shot. She was not smiling in the stiff, formal way that people tended to in photographs, as if they had been told to hold perfectly still, and were concentrating so hard on stillness that every bit of life had drained from their expression. No, this woman had the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth, like she was thinking something privately amusing and had not quite managed to suppress it entirely. Her hands were folded in front of her, and there was a directness in her gaze even through the small, slightly blurred image that made Clyde feel, in an entirely irrational way, that she was looking straight at him. Her name was Eva Prescott. She was 24 years old. She had been a schoolteacher in St. Louis, Missouri, had lost her mother to typhoid fever 2 years prior, and her father, a printer named Harold Prescott, had passed from a weak heart the following winter, leaving Eva alone in a city that had never felt entirely like home. Mrs. Renfield had written all of this in careful, neat script in the letter that accompanied the photograph, and Clyde had read the letter perhaps as many times as he had looked at the picture. He was not a sentimental man by nature. He had been born on the plains of central Texas in 1850, had spent his boyhood learning to rope cattle and read weather and fix fences, had driven cattle up the Kishom Trail twice before he was 20, and had eventually settled in the territory of New Mexico on a modest but growing cattle operation just outside the town of Holloway Creek. He was practical. He was deliberate. He did not romanticize things. But there was something about Eva Prescott's photograph that had lodged itself inside him like a splinter under the skin, not painful exactly, but constantly present, always reminding him of itself whenever he tried to go about his ordinary business. He and Eva had exchanged 5 letters over the course of 4 months. He had been careful in his first letter not to make too many promises or paint too rosy a picture of life on the ranch. He had told her plainly that New Mexico in the summer was brutal, and in the winter was cold enough to make a man question his choices, that the nearest proper town was a half-day's ride, that the work was hard and unending, and that he could not in good conscience ask any woman to come out here without understanding exactly what she was walking into. Eva had written back within 2 weeks. Her letter was composed in a hand that was confident and clear, not flowery or fussy, and she had matched his directness with her own. She had told him that she appreciated his honesty more than he knew, that she had grown tired of people telling her what they thought she wanted to hear rather than what was true, and that she was not afraid of hard work or hard weather. She had also told him, and this was the part that had kept him awake staring at the dark ceiling of his bedroom for 3 nights running, that she was not coming to New Mexico for a life of ease. She was coming, if she came at all, because she believed that a person ought to build something real, and she wanted to know whether he was the kind of man who intended to build something real too. He had written back immediately. He had told her he was exactly that kind of man. He had told her about the ranch, about the land, about the mountains visible on the clear days to the west, about the way the sky in New Mexico at sunset turned colors that no painter had ever quite gotten right. He had not intended to write anything poetic. It had come out anyway. They had exchanged 3 more letters after that, and each one had moved closer to something that felt less like the cautious negotiation of strangers and more like the easy conversation of 2 people who had known each other a long time. By the 5th letter, they had agreed. Eva Prescott would take the stagecoach from St. Louis to Holloway Creek, arriving on the 22nd of August, 1878. Today was the 22nd of August, 1878. Clyde checked his pocket watch. The stage was 40 minutes late, which was not unusual. He had cleaned up as best he could manage, wearing his good shirt and his newer boots, and having spent an embarrassing amount of time that morning trying to get his dark hair to sit flat before giving up entirely. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red stone as the mesas that rimmed the valley. His hands were rough, and his face was weathered from years under the New Mexico sun, and he was acutely aware, sitting on those depot steps, that he looked exactly like what he was. A rancher from the territories, sun-dried and practical, not the sort of figure that appeared in the serialized romantic stories that came in the newspapers from back east. He told himself it did not matter. He told himself Eva Prescott had known from his letters what she was getting. He told himself he was not nervous. He was, in fact, profoundly nervous. The depot agent, a thin man named George Hollies who had worked the Holloway Creek stop for 11 years, came out and leaned against the doorframe with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders. "Stage will be coming up the South Road any time now," George said. "Saw the dust signal from the ridge about 20 minutes back." "Much obliged," Clyde said. George studied him with the particular amusement of a man who had watched enough of the world pass through a stagecoach depot to know what nervous expectation looked like on a person's face. "Waiting on somebody special?" George asked. "Could be," Clyde said. George nodded, apparently satisfied with this answer, and went back inside. Clyde turned the photograph over in his hands one more time. He looked at the faint smile. He looked at the direct eyes. He folded it carefully and put it back in his breast pocket, close to where his heart was hammering against his ribs like a caged thing trying to get out. He heard the stage before he saw it, the crack and rumble of wheels on the dry road, the distant sound of horses working, and then it came around the bend south of town in a cloud of pale dust, the 4 horses pulling hard and the driver up top hauling back on the reins as they came into the yard of the depot. People along the main street of Holloway Creek turned to look, as they always did when the stage came through, because even in 1878 the arrival of a stagecoach still carried with it the drama of news and strangers and things about to change. The stage rolled to a stop. The door swung open from inside. A man in a brown coat climbed out first, then a woman with 2 small children who were immediately scooped up by a man waiting at the edge of the yard, and then a traveling salesman with a case of samples who immediately began looking around for someone to pitch his goods to. And then she stepped down. Clyde Lawson had one photograph of a woman he had never met, and he knew her the moment she stepped down from that stage. He knew her not just from the photograph, though the photograph had prepared him well enough, but from something else entirely, some quality of her that the photograph had somehow managed to capture even through its creases and its blur. The way she moved, the way she looked around at the unfamiliar town with eyes that took everything in without flinching, the way she stood straight and still for a moment after her boots touched the ground, as if she was planting herself deliberately on this new earth. She was wearing a traveling dress of deep blue, dusty from the road. Her dark hair escaped in wisps from the pins that had been holding it in place for what Clyde imagined had been a very long journey. She carried a small valise in one hand and she had a leather satchel over her shoulder, and she was looking at the town of Holloway Creek with an expression that was neither disappointment nor false enthusiasm but something quieter and more honest, curiosity, and the particular kind of courage that looks like composure. Clyde stood up from the steps. She turned and saw him, and something shifted in her expression. Not recognition exactly, because they had never seen each other in person, but something adjacent to it, something like the satisfaction of a prediction confirmed, like when you have been expecting a certain sound and then it comes and your whole body relaxes into the having of it. He crossed the yard toward her. His heart was going so fast he was mildly concerned about his own health. "Miss Prescott," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. "Mr. Lawson," she said. Up close, she was exactly the photograph, and completely beyond it. Her eyes were a shade of brown that had warm amber in them when the light caught them, and there were faint shadows of travel fatigue under them, and her lower lip had been bitten, as if she had been doing some private worrying of her own on that long road. She was looking at him with the same direct quality he had seen in the image, a gaze that did not slide away or hedge, and he found himself more grateful for that than he could have put into words. "I am sorry about the heat," he said, because it was the first useful thing his brain offered him. "August in New Mexico is not its finest month." "It is not so different from St. Louis in August," she said. "Only there the heat is wet." "This is a different kind." "Drier," he agreed. "Yes," she looked at him for a moment. "You are taller than I expected." "Your letters did not specify a preference," he said, and to his relief she laughed, a genuine laugh, brief and unguarded, and the tension of the first meeting cracked open into something much more manageable. "No," she agreed, "they did not. I suppose I should have been more thorough." He reached for her valise. "May I take that, please?" She handed it over and he took the weight of it, noting that it was heavier than it looked, which told him she had not packed lightly, which told him she had packed for the long haul, and that knowledge settled somewhere warm and solid in his chest. He introduced her to George Holly's, who tipped his hat with considerable ceremony, and then Clyde collected the two larger trunks that had been unloaded from the stage's boot, and they made their way to where his horse and wagon were waiting at the hitching rail on the far side of the depot. The main street of Holloway Creek was not an impressive thing, consisting of roughly a dozen buildings along a single dusty thoroughfare, a general mercantile, a blacksmith, a small hotel, a barber, two saloons, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse on weekdays, a land office, a doctor's surgery, and a handful of residences. A few horses stood at various hitching rails. A pair of men in broad hats were having what appeared to be a heated conversation outside one of the saloons. A dog of unclear ancestry was sleeping in the shade of the mercantile's awning. Eva walked beside Clyde and took it all in. He watched her from the side of his eye, trying not to be obvious about it, trying to read what she made of it. "It is small," he said, deciding honesty was still the best course, same as it had been in the letters. "It is," she said, "but it is real." She said this last word with an emphasis that made him look at her. "I have been living in a city that felt like it was made of paper and expectations for 2 years now. I think I will take real." He helped her up into the wagon seat, his hand briefly at her elbow, and then climbed up beside her and released the brake and clucked to the horses. They were quiet for a while as Holloway Creek fell behind them, and the road opened up into the wide, amber-grassed valley between two long ridgelines, the sky enormous overhead and completely cloudless, the mountains to the west a dark smudge against the horizon. There was something companionable in the silence that surprised him. He had expected awkwardness, had braced for it, but the quiet between them felt easy rather than strained. "You said in your last letter that the sunset's turn colors no painter has gotten right," she said after a mile or so. "I stand by that. I would like to see for myself." "You will see one this evening," he said, "if you are not too tired." She turned to look at him, and the afternoon sun was behind her, and it caught the amber in her eyes, and his breath did a small, involuntary thing that he was glad she could not hear. "I am tired," she said, "but not too tired for that." The Lawson Ranch was situated in a broad, sheltered bend of the valley about 8 miles southeast of Holloway Creek, backed up against a rise of red rock, and looking out over grazing land that Clyde had been improving steadily for the past 6 years. The main house was a low adobe structure with a covered porch running the length of the front, solid and plain, surrounded by a kitchen garden that Clyde's part-time housekeeper, a capable woman named Rosa Vargas, had been tending to in anticipation of Eva's arrival. There was a good-sized barn and a corral where 3 horses were currently watching the approaching wagon with mild curiosity. Smoke was coming from the kitchen chimney. Thomas Lawson was waiting on the porch. He was 2 years older than Clyde, stockier, with a broader grin and a tendency toward commentary that Clyde had been managing since childhood. He had ridden over from his own place 3 miles down the valley specifically to witness this moment, a fact that Clyde had mixed feelings about. "Miss Prescott," Thomas called out, stepping down from the porch before the wagon had fully stopped. "I am Thomas Lawson, the better-looking of the 2 brothers, and I want you to know that I am personally responsible for my brother having written that first letter to Mrs. Renfield, so any happiness that results from your being here is largely my doing." Eva looked at Thomas, then at Clyde, then back at Thomas. "Is he always like this?" she asked Clyde. "Unfortunately," Clyde said. "I can work with that," Eva said, and climbed down from the wagon before either brother could assist her, which made Thomas laugh with genuine appreciation and made Clyde feel something warm and proud that he had no name for. Rosa Vargas came out of the kitchen then, a woman in her mid-40s with a quick smile and capable hands, wiping her palms on her apron. She was the wife of Diego Vargas, who worked on the ranch 2 days a week, and she had been helping Clyde keep the house in order since he had moved in. She greeted Eva with a warmth that was immediately real and not performative, and Eva responded to it with equal warmth, and within 5 minutes Rosa had taken Eva inside to show her the house and offer her water and food and a chance to wash the road dust off. Thomas sidled up to Clyde as they unloaded the trunks. "She is not what I expected," Thomas said. "What did you expect?" Clyde asked. "I do not know. Something more fragile. Something that would look at all this land and start calculating the distance back to St. Louis." Thomas picked up one end of a trunk. "She does not look like she is calculating distances." "No," Clyde agreed. "She does not." Thomas studied his brother for a moment over the top of the trunk. "You have already gone and fallen in love with her photograph," Thomas said. "I could tell it the minute you showed it to me, and I can tell now that the real article is considerably worse for your heart than the photograph was." "You do not know what you are talking about," Clyde said, picking up his end of the trunk. "I know exactly what I am talking about," Thomas said cheerfully. "I have been married for 7 years. I know the look." Clyde did not dignify this with a response. He showed Eva the house. It was small by the standards she had known in St. Louis, but it had been built with care, the walls thick and cool, the floors swept clean, the windows facing east and west so that light moved through the rooms across the day. He had put fresh flowers in the bedroom, white ones that Rosa had found somewhere. He was not entirely sure where, and he was self-conscious about that detail in a way that he hoped did not show. Eva stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, looking at the flowers. "Rosa suggested them," Clyde said quickly. "Did she?" Eva said, and the corner of her mouth curved in a way that was exactly like the photograph. Dinner that evening was Rosa's green chili stew, which was the best thing that had ever been cooked in the territory as far as Clyde was concerned, and fresh bread, and Thomas stayed because of course he did, and the table was loud and warm and full of Thomas's stories about Clyde's more embarrassing moments over the years, and Eva listened to all of them with bright eyes, and asked precisely the right questions to extract the most mortifying details. And by the time the meal was over, Clyde had resigned himself to the fact that these 2 people were going to be a force of combined chaos in his life, and he was not entirely displeased about it. After Thomas rode home and Rosa had gone, the house was quiet. The dishes were washed. The lamps were low. Eva stood on the porch in the cooler air of the evening, and Clyde stood beside her, and to the west the sky was doing exactly what he had promised, burning in gradients from deep rose to copper to a purple so saturated it looked like it had been laid on by a heavy brush, the mountains silhouetted dark and jagged against it. "You were right," Eva said quietly. "I usually am," he said, "about the sunsets." She laughed softly. They stood together in the cooling dark and watched the colors deepen and then slowly drain from the sky, stars appearing one by one in the east, and the silence was the most comfortable silence Clyde had ever occupied with another person. "I was frightened," she said eventually, "on the journey here, not of you specifically, but of the whole thing, of having made a decision that could not be unmade." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer that honestly. "So was I," he said. "Frightened, I mean, of whether what was in the letters was real, or whether it was just the best version of ourselves that we had put on paper." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her in the gathering dark, this woman he had known in a photograph and in careful handwritten pages, this woman who had climbed down from a stagecoach in a strange town and planted her feet like she meant to stay. "Now I think the letters were honest," he said. "I think you are exactly who you said you were." "I think you might be too," she said. She looked at him for a moment, then back at the sky. "I think I am very glad I got on that stage." He could have said many things to that. He said simply, "So am I." They said good night at the door of her bedroom. He was sleeping in the smaller room off the kitchen, having set it up that way deliberately, understanding that trust was a thing that had to be built in person just as it had been built through letters, and that a woman who had traveled alone across half a continent deserved to have that understood without her needing to say it. He lay in the dark and listened to the nighttime sounds of the ranch, the horses shifting in the corral, the distant yip of something small and wild on the ridge, and he thought about the moment she had stepped down from the stage, and he had known her immediately and completely. Not just her face, but something essential about her that the photograph had somehow carried. And he thought that whatever was happening to him was quite serious indeed. He fell asleep, eventually, with the photograph still in his breast pocket, and in the morning when he put on his shirt, he moved it to the drawer in his bedside table, because the photograph was no longer the most important thing he had of her. In the first days, they moved carefully around each other in the way of two people who are very aware of each other and are trying not to show it too plainly. Clyde showed her the workings of the ranch, the cattle operation, the kitchen garden, the root cellar, the water situation, the schedule of things that needed doing and when. He did this practically, the way he would have explained the ranch to a new hand, because he thought she would prefer that to being talked to as if she were a visitor to be entertained rather than a person building a life here. He was right. She was interested in all of it, asked sharp questions that showed she was thinking, and twice caught a flaw in his reasoning about the water distribution that he had not noticed himself. "You diverted the secondary channel north last spring," she said on the third morning, standing at the edge of the kitchen garden with her sleeves rolled up and a hoe in her hand, studying the small irrigation ditch that ran along the garden's west edge. "But that means in a dry summer the east end of the garden gets less than the west end. You can see it in which plants are struggling." He looked. She was right. The east end beans were smaller, the leaves a paler green. "I will fix that," he said. "I can fix it," she said. "Show me how." So he showed her, and she worked alongside him in the hot morning sun, and they moved dirt together and redirected water. And by noon the thing was corrected, and they sat in the shade of the porch drinking water from the well, and she had a smear of dirt on her cheek, and she looked, he thought, more alive than anyone he had encountered in recent memory. He told her about the town, about the people in it, about the rough politics of range rights and water rights that occasionally flared up between ranchers in the valley. He told her about Holloway Creek's sheriff, a competent man named Frank Adler who had kept reasonable order for 5 years, and about the less pleasant character of a rancher named Harlan Webb who ran a larger operation to the north and had a habit of behaving as though the rules of fair dealing applied to other people rather than to himself. "Has he caused you trouble?" Eva asked. "Some," Clyde said. "He claims a stretch of the South Creek that has always been shared. He has been trying to fence it off for 2 years. Frank Adler has told him it is not legal to close a shared water source, but Harlan is the kind of man who treats the law as a suggestion when it does not serve him." "What will you do?" "Keep pressing through the land office and through Frank," Clyde said. "I have no interest in a war with Harlan Webb, but I will not give up the water." Eva nodded, thinking this through. "In St. Louis, disputes like that ended up in civil court." "This is not St. Louis," he said. "No," she agreed. "But the principle is the same. You need documentation. Surveys, records of historical use, witnesses. Paper is harder to fight than a fence." He looked at her. "I know how to write persuasive letters," she said, a touch of dry humor in her voice. "I taught composition for 4 years. I have noticed," he said, "that you write excellent letters. Then let me help you write the letters to the land office. A well-constructed argument on paper is worth more than a shouting match over a fence line." He agreed, and that was how Eva Prescott, 4 days after stepping off a stagecoach, became an active part of the business of the Lawson Ranch, and it seemed, to Clyde at least, like the most natural thing in the world. On the Saturday of her first week, he took her into Holloway Creek so she could meet the town and get her bearings. He introduced her to the proprietor of the General Mercantile, a cheerful, red-faced man named Morton Dale, who sold her 2 bolts of calico and a packet of needles, and talked at length about the quality of his coffee beans. He introduced her to the doctor, a steady-handed Scotsman named Andrew Macpherson, who had been in the territory since 1869 and had opinions about everything. He introduced her to Frank Adler, the sheriff, who shook her hand like a man shaking the hand of a person he was measuring up and apparently found the measurement satisfactory, because his face relaxed into a genuine smile. And then they ran into Harlan Webb. He was coming out of the land office as they were passing it on the boardwalk, and he was a wide man, perhaps 50, with a face that had gone red and hard from decades of sun, and from a disposition that tended toward displeasure. He looked at Clyde with the particular expression of a man who considers a neighbor a problem to be managed, and then he looked at Eva with a kind of frank, evaluating appraisal that made the back of Clyde's neck go tight. "Lawson," Webb said. "Webb," Clyde said. "This the woman you sent away for?" Webb asked, his eyes still on Eva in a way that was just barely within the boundary of acceptable but pressing against it. Clyde kept his voice even. "Eva Prescott." "Prescott, this is Harlan Webb." Eva met Webb's gaze directly. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice pleasant and completely controlled. "Long way from home," Webb said to her. "New Mexico is my home now," Eva said without hesitation. Webb looked faintly surprised by that, as if he had expected her to be more easily unsettled. He looked at Clyde again. "We are going to settle that creek matter, Lawson, one way or another." "We will settle it through the land office," Clyde said, "as I have told you." Webb made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been contempt and walked on down the boardwalk. Eva watched him go. "He is used to getting what he wants," she said. "Is," Clyde agreed. "Then we had better make sure the documentation is airtight," she said, "before he decides he is tired of waiting for the land office to move." They went to work on the letters that evening, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, Eva's handwriting quick and clear, Clyde pulling out the surveys and records he had accumulated and sorting them into an order that told the story of the shared water rights most effectively. They worked for 2 hours. She asked questions and he answered them, and she turned his answers into language that was precise and legally persuasive, and he watched her work with a focused admiration that had nothing in it of the condescension that too many men brought to the intelligence of women. "Where did you learn to write like this?" he asked. "I taught children to write," she said, without looking up. "You cannot teach what you do not understand yourself, and my father was a printer. He cared very much about the power of words on paper. He used to say that a well-made argument was the most important tool a person without power could carry. She paused, and something passed briefly across her face, the shadow of grief that had not entirely finished its work. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Clyde said quietly. "He was," she said. She looked up then and met his eyes, and there was an openness in her look that told him she knew he understood about loss, because the ranch had been built partly in memory of his own father who had died 5 years ago, and he had said so in one of his letters. "I think he would have liked you," she said. He did not know what to say to that. He said, "I am glad." She went back to writing. He went back to sorting records. The lamp flickered in a draft from the window. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up on the ridge, and the sound came down through the night air, wild and clear, and Clyde thought that he had been in this house alone for 4 years, and had not known until this moment how completely alone that was. On the Sunday of her second week, Thomas and his wife, Clara, came for dinner. Clara was a practical, warm-natured woman who had grown up on a farm in Kansas and approached life with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that characterized everything about Thomas, who had clearly married his own counterpart. The four of them sat around the big kitchen table and ate roasted chicken and cornbread and talked about everything and nothing. And Clara and Eva fell into conversation with the easy fluency of two people who had been thinking similar thoughts for years without anyone to say them to. After dinner, Thomas and Clyde went out to look at the south fence, which Thomas had an opinion about, and the two women stayed at the table with coffee. And when Clyde came back an hour later, he heard laughter from the kitchen, the kind of full, unguarded laughter that meant the conversation had gone somewhere good. That night, after Thomas and Clara had gone home under a sky crowded with stars, Eva stood on the porch again and Clyde stood beside her again, and it was becoming, he realized, their place, this particular patch of porch boards in the evening. "Clara is wonderful," Eva said. "She is," he agreed. "Thomas does not deserve her. He would agree with that assessment." "She told me something interesting," Eva said. She paused for a moment, looking at the stars. "What did she tell you?" "She said that Thomas told her, when he first showed her your letter to Mrs. Renfield, that you must really feel something to have written it, because you were not a man who wrote about sunsets unless you meant it." Clyde was quiet. "I meant it," he said. "I know," Eva said softly. "That is what I wanted to say." There was a long moment of silence in which the nighttime sounds of the valley filled the space around them, the insects singing and the horses quiet in the corral and the faint distant sound of wind moving through the grass. "Eva," he said. "Yes." He turned toward her. She was already looking at him. "I think I should tell you something," he said. "Because I think you are the kind of person who would rather be told the truth plainly than be left to wonder about it." "I am," she said. "I was not expecting any of this," he said. "When I wrote to Mrs. Renfield, I thought it would come to nothing. I thought I would write a letter or two and some practical arrangement might result from it and I would learn to be content. That is what I was expecting." She was very still, watching him. "But then your photograph arrived," he said, "and then your letters. And now you are here. And I have been trying to find the right way to say this without frightening you or making claims. I have no right to make this early, but I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever met, and I would very much like, if you are willing, for this to be more than a practical arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. The stars were very bright. A light wind moved between them. "Clyde," she said, and his name in her mouth was a thing he had not heard before and immediately knew he wanted to keep hearing. "Yes. I told Mrs. Renfield before I boarded the stage that I was not going to New Mexico to find a convenient situation. I told her I was going because something in your letters made me believe there was a real person at the other end of them who was worth the journey." She paused. "I was right. You are worth the journey." He exhaled something he had been holding without knowing it. "I would like very much," she continued, "for this to be more than a practical arrangement as well." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to, and took her hand. Her fingers were warm and her grip was immediate and certain, not tentative but deliberate, the grip of a woman who made her decisions and then committed to them. They stood like that for a long time in the New Mexico night, hand in hand on the porch, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the valley was dark and wide and free around them. And Clyde Lawson felt something happen inside his chest that he had no word for, large and quiet and permanent, like the mountains settling further into the earth. The weeks that followed were full of the business of ordinary life and the extraordinary business of two people discovering each other. Eva took over the management of the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that resulted in a harvest that made Rosa Vargas exclaim with genuine pleasure. She helped with the household accounts, which had been in a state of functional but artless disorder, and organized them into a system that made Clyde able to see immediately how the ranch was doing rather than having to calculate it painfully from scattered receipts. She also began, quietly, to take stock of the needs of the surrounding community in a way that seemed instinctive rather than deliberate. She learned from Rosa about the families in the area, the Vargas family of course, and the other Mexican and Mestizo families who had been in the valley long before the Anglo settlers arrived and who existed in the complex, often unjust social terrain that characterized New Mexico in this period. She asked Rosa about their children and what educational resources they had access to, which was almost nothing, the church school in Holloway Creek being poorly attended by anyone not Anglo. "I was a teacher," Eva said to Clyde one evening. "For 4 years, I taught reading and writing and arithmetic and history." "I know," he said. "You told me so." "There are children in this valley who cannot read," she said. "There are children in the Vargas family alone. Diego and Rosa have 4 children under 12, and I asked Rosa yesterday whether they attend school, and she said they go sometimes but that the schoolmaster, Mr. Haverford, makes them feel unwelcome." Clyde set down the harness he had been mending. "Haverford has always been a small man in the worst sense of the word," he said. "I would like to start a reading session here at the ranch," Eva said. "Once a week for any children whose parents would like them to come. No charge. I would need some paper and pencils and a few books from the mercantile." He looked at her. "Of course," he said. "Whatever you need." The first session had 6 children, ranging in age from 5 to 13, seated around the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with sheets of paper in front of them, and Eva at the head of the table, with a reader she had brought from St. Louis in her trunk. By the end of the second month, there were 11 children, and 2 of their mothers had begun attending as well, and what had started as a simple reading session had become something larger and more important, a small school of its own in the kitchen of the Lawson Ranch. This was not without its complications. Haverford, the Holloway Creek schoolmaster, was not pleased when word reached him, and there were a few pointed comments made in public about the appropriateness of an unmarried woman running an informal school without official sanction. These comments made it back to Eva and to Clyde, and Eva's response to them was to continue exactly what she was doing, and Clyde's response was to have a quiet word with Frank Adler, who had no objection to what Eva was doing and made that clear to anyone who asked. Harlan Webb's response was more pointed. He came to the ranch on a Thursday morning, unannounced, riding into the yard with 2 of his hands and calling out for Clyde in a manner that was just short of aggressive. Clyde came out of the barn to meet him. "What is this I hear about your woman holding school for Mexican children on your property?" Webb demanded. "She is teaching children to read," Clyde said. "I would think that is a thing most reasonable people would have no issue with." "It is not your business to reform this valley," Webb said. "And it is not her business either, whatever she may think." "She disagrees," Clyde said, "and so do I, and as it is my property, I believe our opinion on the matter is the one that counts." Webb's face went a shade redder. "You want to make an enemy of me, Lawson." "I already have an enemy of you over the creek," Clyde said evenly. "This is a separate matter, and it is not up for discussion." Webb held his gaze for a long moment, then turned his horse and rode out of the yard without another word, his two hands following, and Clyde stood and watched them go with his hands loose at his sides and a steadiness in his gut that came from having said exactly what he meant. He told Eva about it that evening. She listened to the whole account without interrupting. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need to thank me for that," he said. "I know," she said, "but I want to." She was sitting across from him at the kitchen table, the lamp between them again, and she was looking at him with an expression that he had learned over the weeks to read as the look she wore when she was thinking something she had not quite decided to say yet. He waited. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right. We have been going about this carefully," she said, "and I appreciate that because it was the right way to begin. But I have been in New Mexico for nearly 2 months now, and I know this ranch, and I know this valley, and I know you." She stopped. "Do you know me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Then I would like to know," she said, "whether you intend to ask me to marry you or whether I ought to begin thinking of other arrangements." He stared at her. Then he felt a laugh move up through him that was equal parts amusement and pure relief. "Eva Prescott," he said. "Clyde Lawson," she said in exactly the same tone. "I intend to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have been working up to it." "I see," she said. "How much longer did you need?" "Apparently no longer at all," he said, and stood up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood too. And he took both her hands in his and looked at her in the warm lamplight with all the plain truth of what he felt showing on his face, and said, "Eva, I knew you from a photograph. I knew something in you from your letters. I know you now in person, and every version of you I have encountered has been more than I deserved and exactly what I did not know I needed. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said immediately, "I will." He kissed her then, her hand still in his, a kiss that was brief and warm and entirely certain. And when he pulled back, she was looking up at him with that curve at the corner of her mouth that he had fallen in love with in a faded photograph on the steps of a stagecoach depot. And he thought that if he lived to be 100, he would not run out of gratitude for the fact that she had gotten on that stage. Thomas was insufferably pleased about all of it. He said, at least 4 times in the first week after the announcement, that he had personally arranged the entire thing and that he expected credit proportional to his contribution. And Clara told him firmly that his contribution had been approximately equal to that of a man who hands someone a fishing pole and then claims credit for the fish. And Eva laughed so hard at this that she had to sit down. And Clyde loved all of them in that moment, with a fullness he had not expected to have at this point in his life. They were married on a Saturday in October 1878, in the church in Holloway Creek, with Frank Adler standing as witness and Thomas standing as best man, and Rosa Vargas crying quietly in the front pew, and Diego Vargas sitting beside her with the dignified composure of a man who is also crying, but has committed to the position that he is not. There were perhaps 30 people in the church, most of the town and several of the ranching families from the valley, and the light through the church windows on that October morning was the clear, golden light of a New Mexico autumn that has no equivalent anywhere else on earth. Eva wore a dress that she had made herself from the blue calico she had bought at Mortondale's Mercantile on her first Saturday in Holloway Creek, altered and fitted in the evenings over the preceding weeks. And she looked, in Clyde's entirely biased estimation, more beautiful than any person had any right to be in a room full of dusty-booted ranchers and their families. She walked down the aisle of that small church under her own power, no father to give her away because her father was gone, and she had thought carefully about this, and decided that she would give herself. And this decision seemed to Clyde, watching her come toward him with her eyes on his face and her spine straight and her step certain, to be exactly the right one. The minister, a young man named Pastor Elias Croft, who had been in Holloway Creek for only a year and brought with him a refreshing absence of pomposity, married them with words that were simple and genuine. And when it was done, and they were standing face to face with their hands joined, and their names newly combined in the law, Eva Prescott became Eva Lawson, and Clyde Lawson felt the word settle over both of them like something that had been true for longer than either of them knew. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the church hall, which Rosa had spent 2 days preparing for with the assistance of several other women from the valley, and there was food enough for twice the number of people present, and somebody produced a fiddle, and somebody else produced a guitar, and the afternoon wore on in music and eating, and the kind of conversation that happens between people who live hard lives in an unforgiving country, and therefore know how to celebrate the good things when they come. Harlan Webb did not attend, which was neither a surprise nor a disappointment. Clyde danced with his wife 3 times, and each time he was astonished all over again by the fact of her. This woman who had been a photograph, and then a letter, and then a person stepping off a stage into his life, and now a hand in his as they moved together across the rough church hall floor, while Thomas and Clara danced beside them, and Thomas said something that made Clara laugh so loudly that the fiddle player lost his place. The ride home in the wagon that evening was quiet and warm. Eva sat close beside him rather than at the far end of the seat, her shoulder against his arm, the October air cool around them and the sky already beginning to fill with its evening display. "Happy?" he asked. "Profoundly," she said. "Good," he said. "So am I." She took his arm in both her hands and leaned her head against his shoulder, and he drove the horses home through the gathering dark of his wedding day with his wife beside him and the stars coming out overhead, and the mountains dark against the horizon, and the feeling that moved through him was not complicated. It was simply the largest, quietest happiness he had ever known. The autumn deepened, and the ranch settled into its winter preparations, and life took on the texture of shared routine that is the real substance of a marriage. The mornings that began before dawn with the animals needing tending, and the kitchen needing warmth, and the 100 small things that held a working life together. Clyde had always moved through this routine with a competence that was also a kind of solitude, each task completed and moving to the next, the work its own company. Now Eva was in all of it, not in the way of an imposition, but in the way of a person who had found her place, and moved through it with the same purposeful ease she brought to everything. She continued her teaching sessions through the autumn and into the early winter, expanding them to twice weekly as the children progressed and new ones joined. She wrote to a bookseller in Santa Fe and arranged for a shipment of readers and primers and arithmetic books, paid for from the household accounts after she had identified a small surplus that her reorganization of the finances had uncovered. She documented the progress of each child carefully, keeping records in a notebook that she added to after every session, the same methodical attention to evidence she had brought to the water rights letters. Those letters, submitted to the land office in Albuquerque in September, produced results in November. A formal surveyor's determination that the South Creek was indeed a shared waterway under territorial law, and that Harlan Webb had no right to fence or restrict it. The document arrived on a Tuesday, and Eva read it at the kitchen table, and then set it down and looked at Clyde with a satisfaction that was not triumphant, but simply the satisfaction of a thing done correctly. "We should keep a copy at the house and file the original with Frank Adler," she said. "Already thinking 3 steps ahead," he said. "Always," she said. Webb received the determination with poor grace. He came by the ranch once more in December, this time alone and with a slightly different energy, less aggressive and more calculating. He did not come to argue. He came, apparently, to take the measure of the Lawsons now that they had demonstrated they could win a legal dispute, and when he left with a quietness that told Clyde the water fight was over for now, and Webb would redirect his energies elsewhere, and that was the best outcome that could be hoped for with a man like Harlan Webb. Winter in New Mexico was cold, as Clyde had warned, the nights deep and bitter and the days short, but the adobe held the heat well and the firewood was stacked high, and there was enough work indoors and out to fill every hour of it. Clyde taught Eva to ride properly in the early winter, before the worst of the cold set in, taking her out on a steady, sensible mare named Biscuit, who had been reliable under Clyde's hands for 4 years, and proved equally reliable under Eva's. And Eva took to it with the same determined competence she brought to everything. And within 3 weeks, she was comfortable enough in the saddle to ride out with Clyde when he checked the herd. They rode together in the crisp December mornings, the land white with frost at the edges of things, the cattle moving in slow, dark clusters across the pale grass, the sky that particular deep winter blue that belonged to the high desert. And Clyde would explain what he was looking at when he watched the cattle, and Eva would ask questions and store the answers, and add them to the growing body of knowledge she was building about the operation of this ranch that was now as much hers as his. She told him about St. Louis in return, about what it had been like to grow up in a city, the particular density of it, the noise and the commerce and the gaslit evenings, and the way every person was surrounded by every other person all the time, which she had thought was a form of company but had understood, after her parents died and left her alone in that crowd, was not company at all. She told him about her students, about the children she had taught, and the satisfaction of watching a child discover that letters meant words and words, meant stories and stories, meant the whole wide world was more accessible than it had been the day before. She told him about her mother, who had loved to sing, and who had died on a Wednesday in March, and who Eva still sometimes heard singing in the early morning when the house was quiet. He listened to all of it. He was, she told him once, the best listener she had ever known, which surprised him because he did not think of himself as especially good at it. But she said that listening was not about being quiet while someone talked. It was about responding in a way that showed you had actually taken in what they said, and he apparently did that. Christmas came, the first Christmas of their marriage, and Clara and Thomas came with their 2 sons, James and William, 8 and 6 years old respectively, who immediately attached themselves to Eva with the focused devotion of small boys who had recognized a person willing to pay them genuine attention. The Vargas family came for the afternoon, all 6 of them, and Rosa brought tamales that were so good they temporarily ended all conversation. And there was a small exchange of gifts, practical things mostly, a good pair of gloves for Clyde from Eva, a set of writing supplies from Clyde for Eva, tools for Thomas, fabric for Clara. But Clyde had also, through a complicated arrangement involving a letter to a bookseller in Kansas City, and Thomas riding to pick up the package when it arrived on the stage, acquired a collection of poetry that he had remembered Eva mentioning in her 3rd letter, a poet she had loved since her father had read it to her as a child. He wrapped it in brown paper and gave it to her after the others had gone home, the house quiet around them and the fire burning low. She unwrapped it and looked at it, and he saw her face go still and soft in the firelight. "How did you remember this?" she asked. "3rd letter," he said. "You mentioned your father used to read it to you." She looked up at him over the book, and her eyes were bright in a way that was almost tears but was not quite, and she said, "Clyde Lawson, you are dangerous." "In what respect?" he asked. "In the respect," she said, "that you pay attention in a way that makes a person feel very known." He crossed the room to where she was sitting and sat beside her on the settle, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she opened the book to the 1st page and began to read to him in her clear, steady voice, the words filling the warm room, and he sat beside his wife in the firelight on Christmas evening and listened to poetry for the first time in his adult life, and thought that this, precisely this, was what a life was supposed to feel like when it was going right. January brought snow, deep and quiet and transforming, and the work of the ranch in a snowy winter was harder and more physical, the cattle needing supplemental feed, the water troughs needing to be broken of ice each morning, the horses needing more careful management. Clyde was out before dawn most days, and Eva was up with him, making coffee and breakfast before he went out, and sometimes coming out herself to help when the work called for more than 2 hands. It was in the middle of one of those cold January mornings, with snow on the ground and the sky a uniform pale gray, that Diego Vargas arrived at the ranch on horseback, riding harder than his usual steady pace. Clyde was in the barn and came out at the sound of the horse to find Diego pulling up in the yard, his face serious. "There is trouble on the South Range," Diego said. "Two of your fence lines are down. Webb's men were seen near there yesterday." Clyde went inside to tell Eva he would be gone for several hours and to get his rifle, which he had hoped not to need. "I am coming with you," Eva said. "It could be rough," he said. "Clyde," she said, looking at him steadily, "I am not a woman who waits at home while things are happening. You knew that when you married me." He had known that. He said, "Get your coat." They rode out together, Clyde and Eva and Diego, and found the south fence exactly as reported, 2 sections down, and cattle wandered through the gap into an area that was too close to Webb's land for comfort. There was no sign of Webb's men now, and no proof of who had done it, just the posts pulled and the wire cut cleanly, the kind of cut that did not happen accidentally. They spent the morning rounding up the scattered cattle and repairing the fence line, the work cold and hard, and Eva worked alongside them without complaint, her breath steaming in the winter air, her hands in the good gloves Clyde had given her for Christmas. When it was done, Clyde rode to Frank Adler's office in Holloway Creek and reported the damage. Frank listened and made notes and rode out to look for himself, and told Clyde he would look into it, which was all he could promise without more evidence. "It is going to keep happening," Eva said that evening. "Probably," Clyde agreed. "Then we need to make it too expensive for him to keep doing it," she said. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I am going to write to the territorial governor's office." The water rights determination was a good start, but if we can establish a pattern of interference with our operations backed by Frank Adler's reports and our own documentation, there is a case for a broader legal remedy. Clyde looked at her. "You were a schoolteacher," he said. "My father was a printer," she said. "He printed legal documents as well as books. I grew up reading both." She picked up her pen. "Let me work." The letter went to the governor's office in February. The winter continued to grind along, cold and demanding, and Clyde and Diego repaired 2 more instances of fence interference without direct proof of who was responsible, and documented each instance carefully in the log that Eva maintained. Webb himself was not seen near the South Range, which was the frustrating thing about a man like Webb. He had people to do the work that he could disavow. But in March, as the snow began to recede and the grass showed the first pale green of early spring underneath, something shifted. The territorial governor's office wrote back. They were sending an inspector to investigate the pattern of range disputes in the Holloway Creek Valley, a man named Arthur Reeves, who was part of a new initiative to bring greater legal order to the territory in advance of the statehood discussions that were beginning to circulate at the federal level. Webb, apparently having wind of this through his own channels, stopped the interference immediately. The fence lines held. The cattle were undisturbed. The South Creek ran free. Arthur Reeves came through in April, a neat, serious man with wire spectacles, and spent 3 days reviewing documents and interviewing ranchers. And at the end of his visit, he sat in the Lawson kitchen and drank Rose's coffee and told Clyde and Eva that the record they had built was exemplary, that they had done exactly the right things, and that the territorial office was going to be watching the valley with more attention going forward. After Reeves left, Eva sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, and then she looked at Clyde and he saw that the long campaign of the winter, the fence repairs and the cold mornings and the careful letters and the patient documentation, had been more of a weight on her than she had let show. "It is done," he said. "For now," she said. "For now is good enough," he said. He came around the table and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and put her hands over his, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm kitchen, the spring sunlight coming through the east windows, the sound of the ranch resuming its ordinary rhythms outside. "I have something to tell you," she said. He came around to sit across from her. "Tell me." She looked at him with an expression that was new, one he had not seen before, a kind of wondering directness, as if she was looking at something large and trying to take its full measure. "I am going to have a baby," she said. The world went very still for a moment, in the way that it goes still when something of genuine magnitude announces itself. Clyde looked at his wife across the kitchen table in the spring light of 1879, and what happened to him in that moment was not something he had words for then or would have adequate words for later, a kind of enlargement of everything, as if the ranch and the valley and the sky outside the window all became simultaneously larger and more specific, more their own. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I have been certain for about 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I told you." 3 weeks, he said. "I did not want to tell you until I was sure," she said again. "Are you all right?" "I am very much all right," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which was something that had not happened to him since he was a young man, and he was glad for it. He came around the table again, and this time she stood and he held her, his arms around her and her face against his shoulder, and the spring coming through the windows, and he thought about the photograph that was now in the drawer of his bedside table, the woman with the faint private smile, and how he had sat on the depot steps in the August heat and known her the moment she stepped down, and how every single day since had brought something he had not known he was waiting for. "We are going to need to make the house larger," he said into her hair. She laughed against his shoulder. "That is your first response." "It is the practical first response," he said. "I have about 17 other responses behind it." "Tell me one of them," she said. "I am so happy," he said, "that I do not know what to do with it." She pulled back to look at his face, and whatever she saw there made her expression go soft and open and fully undone, and she said, "Good. Neither do I. We will figure it out together." The news spread in the way that news spreads in small communities, with a warmth and an interest that was largely genuine. Thomas came thundering over the very afternoon that Clyde told him, with Clara beside him, and Thomas seized his brother in a bear hug that lifted him briefly off the ground, and Clara embraced Eva with a gentleness and a knowing in it that was the gentleness of a woman who had been through this twice herself. Rosa Vargas, when told, sat down in the kitchen chair and covered her mouth with both hands and then said something in Spanish that was clearly a thanksgiving, and Diego stood in the doorway of the barn with the careful dignity of a man moved but not wanting to show it, and said, "It is good news. It is very good news." Andrew Macpherson, the doctor, examined Eva in May and confirmed the pregnancy as healthy and the expected arrival as sometime around the end of October or the beginning of November. Clyde began work on the addition to the house in late April, a second bedroom and an expanded parlor, working with Diego on the weekends and using the skills he had learned from his father, who had built the original structure with his own hands. Eva was involved in every decision about the addition, from the placement of the windows to the depth of the shelving in the new room, and she was characteristically precise in her preferences and characteristically willing to be persuaded when a different approach was clearly better. Spring in New Mexico was the best of all its seasons, the land green with winter moisture, and the sky an impossible blue, and the cattle fat, and the kitchen garden erupting with the things Eva had planted in late March. The Tuesday and Thursday teaching sessions continued, and the children were progressing in ways that made Eva's careful documentation come alive with evidence of real change. Children who had been unable to read a sentence in September now reading full pages. Children who had struggled with numbers now working their way through arithmetic problems with growing confidence. Haverford, the official schoolmaster, had eventually ceased his objections, partly because Frank Adler had made it gently but clearly known that he saw no reason to interfere with private educational charity, and partly because Eva's sessions had begun to improve the overall literacy of the community in ways that even Haverford's more stubborn prejudices could not entirely dispute. The summer was hot, and the work was heavy, and Eva, as the months moved forward, found herself having to cede some of the harder physical tasks to others, which she did with an impatience that would have been difficult if Clyde had not learned by this point to navigate her impatience with a combination of genuine respect for her capacity and the occasional quiet practical observation that seemed to have no opinion in it, but gently moved her toward the reasonable choice. She taught her classes through August, sitting at the head of the kitchen table with her growing middle and a completely undiminished intensity of focus that made the children, who were at ages where they noticed everything, treat the change in her appearance as entirely unremarkable because her manner was entirely unchanged. August brought the first anniversary of her arrival. Clyde remembered it before she did, by about a day, and on the evening of the 22nd he brought her out to the porch at sunset because the 22nd of August in New Mexico was never going to be anything other than the day she stepped off that stage, and he thought that was worth marking. She stood on the porch with one hand resting on the swell of her middle, and the sky to the west did exactly what it had done 1 year ago, the colors running up through rose and copper and deep violet, the mountains cutting their dark shapes against it. 1 year, she said. 1 year, he confirmed. She looked at him sideways. Do you remember what you said to me that first evening, the first thing you said to me? He thought. I said I was sorry about the heat. She laughed. You were apologizing for the weather. It seemed like the right thing to address, he said. You had just come off a stage in August. And now, she said, 1 year later, and you have still not fully stopped apologizing for the weather. It is genuinely very hot in August, he said seriously. She laughed again, the full unguarded laugh he had heard for the first time on the day they met and had been quietly grateful for every day since. She leaned against him, his arm coming around her, and they watched the last of the sunset fade and the stars begin, the same stars that had been over the porch on the night he had taken her hand for the first time, unchanged and brilliant. Thank you, she said. For what? For being exactly what your letters promised, she said. For being worth the journey. He held her close in the warm evening air and said, The journey was mine too, Eva. Every day of it. The baby came on the 3rd of November 1879, during a cold snap that had brought the temperature down sharply overnight, with Andrew Macpherson attending and Rosa Vargas present as support, and Clyde waiting in the kitchen in a state of controlled near panic that he managed to keep from being obvious only because he had the good sense to keep himself busy with the fire and the kettle. The baby was a boy. He was born in the early afternoon, in the bedroom with the white flowers that had long since been replaced by other things but whose ghost Clyde still thought about sometimes. And when Macpherson brought him to the kitchen door and told Clyde it was done and everyone was well, Clyde sat down abruptly in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands for a moment, not from distress, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of relief and gratitude and love. They named him Henry Harold Lawson. Henry after Clyde's father, who had built the house and taught Clyde everything about the land. Harold after Eva's father, who had been a printer who believed in the power of words on paper, and who had raised a daughter fierce and clear-eyed enough to get on a stage to New Mexico and build something real. Henry Harold Lawson was a substantial baby with a serious expression that his mother said he had clearly inherited from his father and his father said he had clearly inherited from his mother, and who turned out, in the weeks following his arrival, to have a strong preference for being held upright, and a tendency to watch everything around him with an attentiveness that somehow immediately suggested he was already taking notes. Clyde held his son in the early mornings when the baby woke before Eva needed to, sitting in the chair by the bedroom window in the cold pre-dawn dark, the infant tucked against his chest, and talked to him in a low voice about the ranch and the valley and the mountains that would be Henry's horizon as he grew, and about his grandfathers who would have loved him, and about his mother, who was the most remarkable person Clyde had ever known. Henry listened, or at least appeared to, with that steady, watchful attention. Life arranged itself around the new reality of a child in the house, not without difficulty, because a working ranch with a newborn required a reorganization of all the previous rhythms, but with the collective goodwill of everyone in their circle. Rosa came more days than before. Thomas and Clara brought their boys over on weekends, and James and William, 8 and nearly 7 now, regarded Henry with the complicated mixture of fascination and skepticism that older children bring to the arrival of babies. Clara provided Eva with the kind of practical knowledge that only someone who has done this before can offer, and Eva received it with the gratitude of a woman who was competent in most things and wise enough to know when she was learning something new. The teaching sessions paused for a month and then resumed, with the modification that Henry's basket sat in the corner of the kitchen during class, and the children, who had initially been distracted by his presence, quickly incorporated him into the ordinary landscape of their Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and largely ignored him unless he made noise, at which point they would observe with interest and then return to their work when the noise subsided. Winter passed, and the early spring of 1880 came, and with it a letter from the territorial government that told Clyde that Harlan Webb had been formally cautioned by the inspector's office regarding his pattern of range interference, and that a record of the previous incidents had been placed in the official register. It was not justice in the fullest sense, but it was the formal weight of the law placed on the right side of the line, and Webb knew it was there, and the fence lines had held through the entire winter without incident. Clyde read the letter at the kitchen table and then handed it to Eva, who was feeding Henry across from him, and she read it with Henry's small hand curled around her finger and the morning light coming through the window. "It is enough," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She handed the letter back and looked at him over their son's head. "He is never going to be a friendly neighbor," she said. "No," Clyde agreed, "but he will be a legal one, and that is all I need from him." She nodded, satisfied. "Good, then that chapter is closed." It was. Webb kept his distance and his grievances to himself and found other avenues for his ambitions, and the South Creek ran free through the seasons as it had always run, and the Lawson cattle drank from it alongside the few others who had traditional rights there, and the land went on being what it had always been. Spring turned to summer, and summer turned to another autumn, and the ranch grew steadily, a careful growth rather than an ambitious one, Clyde preferring to build well over building fast, adding cattle as the land could sustainably support them, improving the water situation on the east end of the range, extending the kitchen garden under Eva's direction until it was producing enough surplus that she began trading produce with other families in the valley, which was not a formal arrangement, but became an informal one that benefited everyone involved. Henry grew with the steady intensity of a child who has decided that the world is interesting and worth his full engagement. By the time he was walking, which happened at 9 months with a determination that made Macpherson say he had never seen a baby treat gravity as such a personal affront, he was also clearly listening to everything said around him with a comprehension that ran ahead of his ability to speak. His first word, at 11 months, was not, as many people expected, either of his parents' names. It was a word he apparently picked up from Eva's teaching sessions, said in the kitchen one Tuesday morning while looking at the letters written on the board Eva had acquired for the classroom. He said, "Read." Eva looked at Clyde over the heads of the assembled children, who were as surprised as the adults. "His grandfather would have loved that," she said. "Both of them would have," Clyde said. The year moved through its seasons and another year after it, the ranch its rhythms and the valley its community and the marriage its ongoing discovery. Because Eva was right. Clyde had told her she was exactly who she said she was, and that continued to be true. But who she was had layers that kept revealing themselves, in the way that real people are not finished when you think you have understood them, but go on surprising you in ways that are not unsettling but illuminating. She surprised him by proving to be an unexpectedly good judge of cattle, learning from observation and question to read an animal's health and temperament in a way that was useful rather than theoretical. She surprised him by having an opinion about architecture that was both strong and well-reasoned when they discussed whether to add a second story to the house as the family grew, which they were beginning to think it might. She surprised him by being willing to be wrong, to say plainly when she had been incorrect about something, and to adjust without drama, which was rarer than it should have been among people in general, and was in her so natural as to be simply part of the furniture of who she was. She surprised him, in the autumn of 1881, by telling him at the kitchen table one evening, with Henry asleep in his room and the lamp burning between them in its familiar way, that she was going to have another baby. He looked at her. She was looking at him with the same wondering directness as the first time. "Are we ready for this?" he asked. "I was ready for New Mexico," she said. "I can be ready for this." "Fair point," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned hers over and held his, and they sat together in the warm kitchen with the ranch quiet around them, and the future as wide and unremarkable and extraordinary as the New Mexico sky. The second baby arrived in March of 1882, a girl this time, born in the early morning as the first light was coming up behind the eastern ridge, healthy and insistent about her presence from the first moment, with a cry that had more opinion in it than most adults manage to express. They named her Clara Jane Lawson, Clara for Thomas's wife, who wept when she heard it, and Jane for a great aunt of Clyde's who had been, by all family accounts, a woman of particular character. Henry, who was 2.5, received his sister with the careful suspicion of a child who has been told something is coming and has not entirely decided how he feels about it. Within a week he had made his decision, which was that Clara Jane was acceptable and that he was personally responsible for her welfare, a position he held with an earnest dedication that made both his parents regularly need to conceal smiles. The ranch in 1882 was a different enterprise from the one Eva had found when she stepped off the stage in 1878. It was not transformed beyond recognition, but it was grown and improved and more fully itself, the way a living thing grows into what it was meant to be when given the right conditions. The cattle operation was profitable in a steady way that Clyde preferred to dramatic boom and bust. The house had its addition, and then its second story, added over the summer of 1881, and had stopped being small a while ago, the rooms filled with the artifacts of a life well lived, books and sewing and ranch records, and the children's drawings that Eva pinned to the wall of the parlor with the same careful attention she gave everything she found worthy of noting. The teaching sessions had, over 4 years, grown from a weekly gathering of 6 children in the kitchen to a twice-weekly institution that had been formally acknowledged by the county school board after Eva wrote them a letter that Thomas later described as the most polite but utterly devastating piece of correspondence he had ever read, laying out in careful, documented, entirely unarguable terms the gap in educational provision for non-Anglo children in the valley, and what had been done to address it in the absence of official support. The county board had, in the end, provided a small amount of funding and formally designated the Lawson Kitchen School as a recognized educational supplementary program, which was not full acknowledgement of the injustice that had made it necessary but was a step in the right direction, and Eva had taken it as such. Haverford had retired the previous year and been replaced by a younger woman named Miss Sarah Whitfield, who had trained as a teacher in Denver, and who came to Holloway Creek with no particular prejudices and a genuine curiosity about what Eva had built, and who within 2 months had become a collaborator rather than a complication, working with Eva to develop a curriculum that could be used by both the official school and the supplementary sessions. It was not a perfect world. The injustices that had shaped the valley, the displacement of the Pueblo communities whose land this had been long before any of these events, the legal and social inequalities that Rosa and Diego Vargas and their children navigated daily, were not resolved by letters to the county board or by a good water rights determination. They were the larger and more intractable facts of the time and place, and Eva knew it and said so plainly when it came up, because she was not a woman who pretended comfortable things about uncomfortable realities. But within the territory she actually inhabited and could actually affect, she worked steadily and without illusion, and that was what she had. Clyde watched his wife through these years with the particular attentiveness he had given her from the beginning, the attentiveness she had named and described as rare. He did not think of it as rare. He thought of it as the natural consequence of being in the presence of someone worth paying attention to. He thought about the photograph sometimes. Not with the desperate frequency of that first week of August 1878, when he had pulled it from his pocket 100 times and tried to know her from its creases and blur, but occasionally, in the way you remember the moment before a thing became fully real, the held breath before the breath was released. He had moved it from the drawer to a small frame on the shelf in the bedroom, where it sat between a photograph of his father taken in 1871 and a tintype of Eva's parents that she had brought from St. Louis in her trunk. Eva had noticed it there one evening and stood looking at it for a moment. "Is that the photograph Mrs. Renfield sent?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She looked at it for another moment. "I remember that day. The photographer told me not to smile, and I could not stop almost smiling." "It shows," he said. She looked at him. "That is the thing about it," he said. "Everyone else in a photograph holds still and goes blank. You could not quite manage it. I saw something alive in it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the small framed image. "I thought it was strange," she said, "to send a photograph to a stranger. It felt very exposed." "It was brave," he said. "It was desperate," she said, with the honesty that was so entirely her. "It was both," he said. "Most of the bravest things are." She turned to look at him then in the warm lamplight of their bedroom, with the sounds of their children sleeping down the hall, and said, "I was frightened and I got on the stage anyway." "I know," he said. "I am glad every day that you did." She came to where he was standing and put her hand flat on his chest in the way she sometimes did, and he put his hand over hers, and they stood together in the quiet room with the photograph on the shelf and the ranch outside the window and everything they had built around them. And it was not dramatic or large in the way of grand gestures, but it was the most real thing Clyde Lawson had ever been part of, and he knew it, and he held it the way you hold something you have understood the value of. The spring of 1883 brought a development that none of them had anticipated. Thomas came to the Lawson kitchen on a Wednesday morning with a letter in his hand and an expression that was simultaneously excited and uncertain, which on Thomas was unusual enough to make Clyde set down his coffee. "There is land available farther north," Thomas said. "A full section. Water rights already settled. Price is right because the previous owner is moving back east." "And," Clyde said. "And I think you should buy it," Thomas said. "Not me. Your operation has been growing. You need more range." Clyde looked at Eva, who had come in from the garden with Clara Jane on her hip and dirt on her gloves. "Let me see the letter," Eva said, setting the baby on the kitchen rug with a wooden spoon to occupy her. She read it standing at the counter, pulling off her gloves as she went, and then she looked at Clyde. "The water rights situation needs verification," she said. "The price is reasonable if the land is what the letter claims. We would need to ride out and look at it ourselves." "I know all of that," Clyde said. "What do you think?" She looked at him. "I think that 4 years ago you had a modest but growing operation, and now it is larger and more solid, and the question is whether we want to grow it further or keep it at a manageable size." "And," he said. "And I think Henry is going to grow up," she said, "and Clara Jane behind him, and any others who may come after them." She paused. "I think a larger operation is a thing worth building if you build it at the right pace and for the right reasons." "The right reasons," Thomas said, interested. "Because it is worth building," Eva said. "Not because we want to be the biggest ranch in the valley, because the land is good and the work is honest and we know how to do it." Clyde looked at his brother. "She is right," he said. "She is almost always right," Thomas said cheerfully. "It is her most consistent characteristic." They rode north the following weekend. All four of them, Clyde and Eva and Thomas and Clara. The children left with Rosa for the day and looked at the land, which was good land as the letter had described. A broad section of valley floor with adequate water and good grass, and the kind of solid potential that required work to realize but would reward the work honestly. Clyde walked it for 2 hours while Eva walked it separately, and they came back to the horses and compared their observations and agreed. It was worth the price and the effort. The purchase went through in May 1883, and the work of absorbing the new land into the operation began, which meant more fencing and more cattle management and more hands, which meant hiring, which led to the addition of 2 full-time ranch hands, brothers named Eli and James Cutter, young men in their 20s from Kansas who had come west looking for work and who proved to be reliable and capable in the way that mattered more than any credentials. The ranch grew. The children grew. Henry, at 4, was already trailing his father around the ranch with the dogged intentionality of a child who has decided he is going to understand everything, asking questions faster than anyone could reasonably answer them. Clara Jane, at 2, was the loudest and most opinionated person in the household by a considerable margin, which Eva said was the inheritance of a daughter born to 2 people who had opinions, and which Clyde said was an understatement. One evening in the summer of 1883, Clyde sat on the front porch in the cooling dark after the children were in bed, and Eva came out and sat beside him, and the valley was wide and quiet, and the stars were out in their thousands over the New Mexico sky, unchanged and brilliant as they had always been. "Do you remember the first evening you were here?" he said. "Of course," she said. "I said August was not New Mexico's finest month. And I said the heat was different from St. Louis," she said. "Drier, and then we stood here and watched the sunset," he said. She leaned against his shoulder the way she had for years now, the ease of long familiarity which was its own kind of warmth, different from the early charged awareness but no less precious. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what my father would have said," she said. "If he had lived to know that I came here, that I built this." She paused. "He would have worried at first. A woman going alone across half the country to marry a stranger, he would have worried." "And then," Clyde said. "And then he would have come to visit," she said, "and he would have sat at that kitchen table and watched you with the children and talked to you about the ranch and the territory, and by the end of the first evening he would have said privately to me that I had done well." She was quiet for a moment. "He would have been right. I would have liked to know him," Clyde said. "You would have liked each other," she said. "You are similar in the ways that matter." He turned to look at her in the dark. This woman who had been a photograph and a letter and a person stepping down from a stage and then every day since. This woman who had taken his house and made it a home and his ranch and made it a shared enterprise and his life and made it a life he had not known to want until she showed him what it could be. "Eva," he said. "Yes. I want you to know something," he said. "Tell me." "Every version of you I have known," he said. "From the photograph to the letters to the woman on that depot platform to the woman who sat across from me at that table and told me she was going to have a baby to the woman sitting beside me right now, every single version has been better than the one before. I do not think that is a coincidence. I think that is who you are." She was quiet for a moment. The crickets sang. The horses moved in the corral. "Clyde Lawson," she said, "you have been saying things that level me sideways for 5 years and you do not seem to be slowing down." "I intend to continue," he said. "Good," she said softly. "Please do." She took his hand and they sat together in the warm dark with the ranch around them, their children asleep inside, their life built and building, the stars doing their ancient work overhead. In the autumn of 1884, Eva told him she was expecting a 3rd child, and this time he did not ask if they were ready. He knew they were ready. He knew it the way he knew the land, not from calculation but from the accumulated understanding of years. The 3rd child was born in April of 1885, another boy, healthy and dark-haired like his mother, who came into the world with considerably less drama than Clara Jane had and more observation than Henry had, lying quiet and looking around at the room with a patient curiosity that made Eva say he was going to be a reader. They named him Samuel Diego Lawson. Samuel after Clyde's father's brother, who had been a farmer in Texas and whom Clyde had admired. Diego after Diego Vargas, who had been on the ranch since the beginning and had given Clyde years of loyal, capable work and the kind of friendship that does not make speeches but shows up when the fence is down and the cattle are out in the cold. Diego Vargas, when he heard the name, said nothing for a long moment, and then he looked at the ground and then at Clyde and said, in a voice that was careful and level, "That is an honor." "It is the least of what you deserve," Clyde said. The three children grew in the years that followed, Henry serious and questioning, Clara Jane loud and irrepressible, Samuel quiet and attentive. And the house that had once been a modest adobe on a modest ranch was now a full household, full of noise and homework from Eva's teaching and mud from the ranch, and the smell of Rose's cooking and the sound of horses, and the particular quality of life that happens when people work hard at things that are worth doing and come home to people worth coming home to. The teaching program that Eva had started in her first autumn in Holloway Creek had, by the mid-1880s, become something that the county school board referenced as a model of community educational support, which Eva regarded with measured satisfaction, and no illusions about how much more remained to be done. Miss Whitfield had become a close friend, the kind of friend who comes for dinner and stays till late, and says the things that are too important for polite visits. The Vargas children, who had been among Eva's first students, were growing up literate and capable, and Rosa reported with pride each season the evidence of what that access had given them. Holloway Creek itself had grown in the 7 years since Eva had first driven down its single main street with Clyde beside her on the wagon seat. A new hotel, a telegraph office that had opened in 1881 and changed the speed at which news and business moved. A doctor's surgery expanded since Macpherson had taken on an assistant. A proper schoolhouse built in 1882 with a second room that Miss Whitfield used for her older students. The town was not the same small thing it had been, but it was recognizably itself, and Clyde and Eva were recognizably part of it, not the biggest or the most prominent names in the valley, but solid and known, the kind of people that others measure things against when trying to determine what is fair and reasonable and worth standing behind. Harlan Webb died in the winter of 1885 from a heart complaint that had apparently been building for years. His operation was sold by his heirs to a family from Colorado who came in and did things more straightforwardly, and the water rights that had been such a prolonged source of conflict were simply never raised again. The South Creek ran free. The fence lines held. The valley was quieter without Webb's particular brand of grievance in it. On an August evening of 1885, exactly 7 years after Clyde had sat on the steps of the Holloway Creek depot with a folded photograph in his breast pocket, he and Eva sat on the front porch as they had sat on every version of this evening for 7 years, watching the western sky do its extraordinary work. Henry, who was 5, sat between them on the porch step, leaning against his father's leg, already half asleep. Clara Jane was inside with Rosa, allegedly being put to bed, though the sounds from the house suggested the process was more negotiation than conclusion. Samuel was asleep in his basket in the parlor, because at 5 months he was still in the age of uncomplicated sleeping. The sky went through its colors, rose and copper, and the deep violet that Clyde had tried to describe in a letter once, and that Eva had told him on the day she arrived she wanted to see for herself. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. You were apologizing for the weather when I stepped off that stage, she said. August is genuinely very hot, he said. It is, she agreed. It is also still the best thing I have ever done, getting off that stage. Henry stirred against Clyde's leg and then settled again. Clyde looked at his son, his children, the house they had built together, the ranch that was theirs, the valley that was their home, and then he looked at the woman beside him who had been in a photograph and then in letters and then real and then everything. Eva, he said. I know, she said before he could say the rest of it. I know you know, he said. I'm going to say it anyway. She turned to look at him, her face in the last light of the sunset, warm and known and entirely itself. "I love you," he said. "I loved the photograph before I knew what I was feeling. I loved the letters before I admitted it to myself. I have loved you every day since August 22nd, 1878, when you stepped down from that stage, and I knew you immediately, from a picture that had been folded in my pocket for 3 months, and you looked at this dusty, inadequate town, and said it was real and that you would take real. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I will love you when this ranch and this valley and these mountains are not what they are today, because whatever changes, that does not." The sky was nearly done now, just the last deep color bleeding out at the horizon. Henry breathed against his father's leg. Inside, Clara Jane had apparently won her negotiation and was quiet. Eva looked at Clyde in the fading light for a long moment, with the full direct gaze that had been his first real sight of her, in a photograph, and his first real experience of her, at a stagecoach depot, and had been his every day for 7 years. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you since your third letter, when you described the way the sky looks in New Mexico and tried to apologize for having written something poetic, as if that were something to be embarrassed about. I love you for paying attention. I love you for meaning what you say. I love you for building something worth building and for letting me build it with you. I love you for Henry and Clara Jane and Samuel. I love you for being exactly who your letters said you were, and then more, because who you are cannot be entirely contained in letters. I love you, Clyde Lawson, and I am very glad you had that photograph." He reached for her hand and she gave it, and the last color left the sky and the stars came out, one by one and then all at once, as they always did, as they always would, over the Lawson Ranch in the valley south of Holloway Creek, New Mexico, where a man had once sat on depot steps with a folded photograph in his pocket and waited, not knowing that everything he had not known to want was coming toward him on a stage from St. Louis, stepping down into the August heat with her boots on the ground and her eyes clear and her whole life ready to be made real. The night deepened around them. The ranch was quiet. The children slept. The stars burned on overhead in their thousands, indifferent and magnificent, the same stars that had been over this valley before there were names for it and would be over it long after all names were forgotten. And under them, on the porch of a house they had built together, Clyde and Eva Lawson sat with their hands joined and their lives entirely, completely, fully their own. And the story that had begun with a photograph was not ending, but only settling into the long and ordinary and extraordinary continuance of a love that was real.